Okay,
the book launch is going.
Ladies and gentlemen and audience online, good afternoon and good morning. Welcome to the Center for China and Globalization. I'm Shirley Ren, Director of CCG Publishing Center. Today is our great honor to host this book launch event in CCG. And now, please let me to invite Dr. Mabel Miao, Secretary General of CCG, to deliver the opening remarks. Welcome.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Dear Professor Allison, Mr. Chen, Mr. Dreyer, good afternoon. Welcome to Center for China and Globalization. Welcome to CCG's book launch event. 尊敬的各位来宾
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and Professor Allison and Mr. Chen and Mr. Dreyer, good afternoon. Welcome to attend the book event.
Released the book Escaping Thucydides Trap, Dialogue with Graham Allison on China and U.S. Relations in both Chinese and English. The Chinese edition is published by CITIC Press Group, and the English edition is published by Springer Nature. 今天我们将发布一本重磅的图。
Today we are going to launch the book, and this is the Escaping Thucydides Trap, Dialogue with Graham Allison on China-U.S. Relations, Chinese and English versions. And the Chinese version is published by CITIC Press Group, and English version is published by Springer Nature Group.
It's one of the most often cited concepts when discussing the China and U.S. relationship, particularly since the publication of Professor Allison's book, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides Trap, in 2017. However, there's still a great deal of a misunderstanding about its real argument and implications. The book, Escaping Thucydides Trap, Dialogue with Graham Allison on China-U.S. Relations, based on Dr. Huiyao Wang's in-depth discussions with Professor Graham Allison and Dr. Wang's research on Professor Allison's thoughts contained in the Belfer Center reports, as well as the articles and the interviews Allison has published, aims to introduce the idea of Thucydides trap to a broader audience in an easily digestible format and address some misunderstandings about Professor Allison's argument and find ways to avoid such war between China and the U.S. We are thrilled to celebrate with you all today the launch of the Chinese English edition of this book. I would like to take this opportunity to express my sincere thanks to CITIC Press Group, 特别是中信出版社
especially CITIC Group.
Board of Directors of CITIC Press Group, and Mr. Jiang Yongjun, Vice Editor-in-Chief of CITIC Press Group, and my sincere thanks to Springer Nature, particularly Jacob Joer, Senior Editor of Springer Nature Group. Their support was invaluable to the publication of this book. I would also like to extend my sincere thanks to our dear Professor Graham Allison, who developed the concept of Thucydides trap and the featured guest in this book, for your support on the birth of this book. Professor Allison is Dr. Wang's and my old friend. I remember when we in Harvard, I was a visiting scholar at Fairbanks Center of Harvard, and Henry, Dr. Wang was a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School from 2010 to 2011, and so on. We met Professor Allison at the time, and since then, we have been lucky enough to have many in-depth conversation with you in different occasions. I remember in Munich Security Conference in Davos, and the headquarters of Beijing of CCG, and the different places we conducted the dialogue, even including we visited you in Kennedy School of Harvard. So, Professor Allison, also CCG's old friend, participated in CCG's online discussions, which were part of our CCG Global Dialogue series. Other participants of CCG Global Dialogue Series, including like Joseph Nye, Pascal Lamy, Thomas Friedman, and so on. We have published one book for Joseph Nye, the title Soft Power and Great Power Competition in both Chinese and English. We are very honored to publish Escaping Thucydides Trap, Dialogue with Graham Allison, China-US Relations for Professor Graham Allison. Today it is I remember the second time you visit CCG headquarters here. We are very honored to have him to join us to release the book and give a speech. This book launch is hosted by CCG with support from CITIC Press Group and Springer Nature. 现在我要热烈的邀请
With that, I'd like to invite Chairman Mr. Chen Wei, the Chairman of the Board of Directors.
of CITIC Press Group to give his remarks. Welcome.
Distinguished Professor Allison, Dr. Wang Huiyao, dear friends and media friends, good afternoon and good morning. I'm very happy, together with Dr. Wang and Professor Allison, to attend this book launch event. And this is the first book launch for this book in the world. And congratulations to the successful launch of this book, and also many thanks to CCG. And in recent years, with the competition situation keep changing between China and the U.S., and we can see the frequent events of uncertainties taking place very frequently. And also, the U.S.-China's relationship has become a very important part of the global issues. And also, in the understanding of the global affairs and global relations, the Thucydides trap, actually, its proposal has meant a lot. And in the book, the experts of international relations research and also the professor of the government at Harvard University and the founding dean of the Harvard John F. Kennedy School of Government actually proposed a lot of ideas regarding the Thucydides trap and regarding the international affairs, diplomatics, and the trading conflicts and global challenges. A lot of things has been covered, and in this book, it has been repeatedly called for to look at the competition relations between China and U.S. more calmly, so as to avoid the misunderstanding and misjudgment. And China-U.S. relation has one of the most important international relations. It has not only a lot to do with the economic relations, it also has a lot to do with the prosperity of all human beings at large. And also the purpose of understanding this trap is to avoid this trap. And we have to keep reserved and we have to keep calm so as to join hands between China and U.S. so as to march towards the future trajectories towards peace. And this is really good contribution to the world peace. And we're willing, together with Dr. Wang and Professor Allison, to witness the launch of this book and to witness that the diversity of the relations can help us to understand the possibility of the escaping of this trap, and the understanding and communication between both countries are possible. And in recent years, CITIC Press Group has published a lot of very influential books, which also include the Designed for War, Can America and China Escape a Thucydides Trap, as well as Li Kuan-yew and so on and so forth, which played a very important role for the peaceful relations between both countries. So now I'd like to give many thanks to the support from CCG for the successful editing and also successful launch of this book, and also many care to all of the arena. And also the narrative systems and the storytelling about China is very important, and also very important mission of CITIC Press Group. We have to honor the viewpoints from China towards the world at last. I sincerely hope that this book can bring more enlightening ideas to the readers, and we hope that more readers can understand the ideas of Professor Allison and this idea. Thank you very much.
From Mr. Chen, the CITIC Group. Actually, let's move to another distinguished guest. We know this book's English edition is published by Springer Nature. Let us welcome Mr. Jacob Dreher, Senior Editor of Springer Nature Group. Welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, so I'm using Mandarin now, but later I'm going to resort to English. And thank you. And I'm very happy to attend this meeting.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very, very honored to participate in this event to launch Escaping the Thucydides Trap, which is a collaborative project between Dr. Wang and Dr. Allison. In that way, it's quite inspiring because even in the act of creating this book, they've proven that collaboration and discussion between people who sit in different places and have different subjectivities is possible and rewarding and interesting. I guess all of us are here today because we find their project interesting, and I think we can all agree that the greater project of intercultural dialogue is also interesting. Ever since the original Thucydides Trap, which I remember reading at the time in an excerpt, I think in Foreign Affairs magazine, I've followed Dr. Allison's comments on US-China relations, which have done so much to inform policymakers and ordinary people about the risks at hand and exactly what's going on. I think at the time in 2017, these challenges somehow didn't seem so severe or grave to me. That was in the first year of the Trump administration. And in quite recent memory at the time, the US-China relationship seemed not perfect, but all right during the late Obama years. I was completely shocked on my 30th birthday when Mr. Trump was elected, and a lot of Chinese people near me told, "Sancha Arli." That means at age 30, you know where you are in the world. And I was like, this is horrible. I'm in the Shanghai Waitan, and I'm completely depressed. And I had no idea what's going on in the United States, but I guess here I am in China. So at the time, in 2017, when the Thucydides Trap concept came out, I was like, that's an interesting theory, but I was not completely sure what was going to happen. But since then, it's had a kind of prophetic or almost fateful ring as this relationship spirals out of control. From my perspective, not only under the previous administration, the low point perhaps was more recently in 2022, from my perspective. I never, as an American citizen who's lived in China for more or less since 2008, I've never felt any sort of xenophobia or danger, any of that kind of stuff. But there was a certain moment, I think around the time of the balloon incident, where I started to think, okay, this seems completely crazy, but just because it's completely crazy doesn't mean it won't happen. So I think, it's been a bit of an interesting time this year, last year, I really mean. The notion of a war between the United States and China is ridiculous. The two nations are trading partners. They have unprecedented levels of cultural exchange. Working at Springer Nature, we see in the Nature scientific journal that collaborations between scientists between the United States and China are greater than any other single category of papers in Nature, including papers authored only by Chinese or authored only by Americans or of any other nationality. The most productive of all science nations, if you want to say, is Chimerica. Neither China nor America, but the two of them in tandem. That's what Nature Index reveals to us. For me, I'm married to a Chinese lady, and our second son is on the way this June, so this kind of collaboration means a lot to me personally. For me, I think it's very obvious, and I think it's very clear as we sit in Beijing speaking in English with friends from Boston and from Beijing, this is a no-brainer. And that's exactly why it's been so confusing that our reality has not always cooperated in the recent years. So as we think about what strike us as the real pressing issues that are going to change our way of life, such as climate change or the need to regulate artificial intelligence, it's obvious that dialogue between these two we could say nations, but we could also say cultures or civilizations, is important and vital. So I hope that our respective governments get this very obvious message, and I'm grateful to Dr. Allison for his work in advocating it. For my own part, I'm a patriotic American, and I've lived and worked happily here in China since 2008. At no point have I felt that my doing so is contrary to the spirit of the United States or the founding fathers of the United States, and nor have I felt that my work as a publisher and writer has been jeopardized in any way. The spirit of optimism and exploration which led me to China in 2008 is, for me, a very American spirit. For me, the attributes, personality characteristics which led me to China arose from the optimistic moment of my childhood in the United States in the 1990s. And yet, we don't always see those values reflected in public discourse in the United States today. I recently reread War and Peace, where Tolstoy wrote, "On the 12th of June, 1812, the forces of Western Europe crossed the Russian frontier and war began, an event opposed to human reason and to human nature. Millions of men committed against each other all sorts of crimes, murders, burglaries, as whole centuries have not recorded. But those who committed them did not regard them as crimes." I think we don't need to think too hard about whether war is useless or not. Unfortunately, we've seen several demonstrations in the wars happening around the world today, and none of those conflicts seem any closer to resolution. I guess it's kind of obvious that war is not the answer. I think we all grew up understanding that, and yet, we constantly see these sort of pressures and movements to a completely irrational state of affairs from people who would seem to be rational. Like any partnership, the US and China partnership or relationship is not without its misunderstandings. But for it to have devolved into the sort of dispute that it is today, from my point of view, is tragic. And of course, since Dr. Allison is referring to Greek history in the title of his book, we know that a tragedy is almost something inevitable and driven by fate. It is not just some sort of accidental, who knows why. A tragedy is the outcome of intrinsic parts of our character. And in that sense, I do think the US-China relationship and how it's gone is indeed tragic. From my point of view, I won't comment on China because as a US citizen, I see my responsibility primarily to the United States. The root cause of this issue is the internal conflict within the United States. It's very hard to have meaningful and valuable relationships with other people or anything if you don't understand who you are or what your own values are. And I feel that this internal conflict within the United States underpins so many of our external issues. I remember my first trip overseas when I was 12 years old. I went to Paris, which is this very beautiful city, and I found so surprisingly, as a boy from a small town in Virginia, that a lot of the people in Paris were kind of depressed or didn't seem that happy to be living in this wonderful place. And then when I went back to towns like Waynesboro, Virginia, I met these ordinary people who felt, we live in the best country in the world. That's really how the United States was at that time, perhaps Dr. Allison remembers. And that feeling is harder to find in the United States today. I can't really say why, because if anything, Waynesboro, Virginia is a lot nicer now than it was then. But go figure. Anyway, I believe that when Americans feel more confidence and pride in our own nation, then our relationship with other nations will improve. Similarly, when Chinese diplomats and ordinary people have a deep sense of cultural confidence that we may be required to understand another culture, Chinese culture will flourish. Only when we're firmly founded in our own subjectivity can we really encounter the other. That's what I believe and what I feel I've learned in my own personal life here in China. In 2023, I think that I hope, saw the nadir of US-China ties. For me, I've been a little bit more optimistic ever since the visit to San Francisco of the Chinese president. At that time, I wrote a few articles for the New York Times just talking about what I kind of have been saying today, that this is just so obvious and we need to make it work. On my recent trips to the United States, I found nobody who seemed to be angry and upset about China compared to many people upset about other issues like the war in Ukraine or in Israel-Palestine. But I think that the tragic aspect of this, the sense that fate is driving us forward, is still compelling and in some ways frightening. And I hope that the activities of people like Dr. Wang and Dr. Allison will help us avoid this fate, because I'm an American. In America, we don't believe in fate. We believe in individual responsibility. And I think that individuals can take the responsibility to make sure that our decisions are our own, and we're not pushed into doing anything that's not in our interests. Thank you very much, Dr. Wang and Dr. Allison. I look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Jacob. I think it's a very typical personal story between US and China. I think your kids in the future will be the perfect JV project between US and China. I hope there's more peaceful life for everybody, for our next generation between US and China, for the world as well. Now let's welcome Dr. Huiyao Wang, editor of Escaping Thucydides Trap, this book, who is the president of a Center for China and Globalization, to introduce the origin of this book. Floor is yours, Dr. Wang.
So, dear Graham and also Chairman Chen of CITIC Publishing Group, 还有我们今天来的这个所有的朋友们哈，我们的 CITIC 的讲。
And Mr. Jiang from CITIC and Jacob and friends.
On behalf of Center for China Globalization, welcome Professor Graham Allison, also Chairman Chen and Jacob come to CCG, and also of course so many distinguished guests and scholars, Harvard alumni, journalists, and policymakers, to attend this event. We're very pleased to welcome all of you, and this is really a very exciting moment. So I'll use some PPT to demonstrate, what we actually about this book. So let me start with this book. So, Escaping Thucydides Trap, my dialogue with Graham Allison on China-U.S. relation. 那么这本书呢，中文名字叫做这个跨越修昔底德陷阱啊，王辉耀对话格雷厄姆艾利森论中国与世界啊，这个书实际上是中。
This book is published by CITIC Press Group, a very well-known publisher in China. This is a blockbuster book. Published at the time when there is a lot of tension and uncertainty between China and the United States in terms of their bilateral relationship, and in the times of crisis. How to escape Thucydides' trap? We all know that on October 9th last year, Chinese President Xi Jinping met with a U.S. Senate delegation led by Majority Leader Schumer. And at that time, President Xi pointed out that China-U.S. relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, and our relationship will decide the future of the world. And President Xi says that the Thucydides trap is not inevitable, and the world is large enough to accommodate both China and the United States. So this book is a very timely effort.
She actually already said that. This is the earth is so big, and we can certainly accommodate China and U.S. to peacefully coexist, and we don't have to, necessarily follow the path of Thucydides trap. So this is great. So this book is really a remarkable book that we hope that can stimulate some new thinking and new consensus that build between China and U.S. and for the world peace and prosperity. 那么大家都知道，这个中美关系是
As you all know, U.S.-China relationship is arguably the most important bilateral relationship of this century, as President Xi mentioned a number of times.
Research that he, had to find this trap. So it's really talk about the rising power and also the relation between the existing power. How that going to sometimes, if not careful, may lead to a conflict. So he has his first book on this issue. So 这个Graham 教授在他的第一
In his first book, Professor Allison warns us in his first book, Destined for War, Can China and the United States Escape Thucydides Trap? And after he raised this question, he warns that there is a risk that China and the United States are sliding into that trap, and this has generated global discussion and attention. And President Xi pointed out a number of times that there are no Thucydides trap. However, miscalculation of major powers may lead to Thucydides trap. And with the rising of global south and escalating geopolitical tensions, the U.S.-China relationship has become increasingly complex and is exacerbated by trade disputes, global challenges, the chips issue, etc. So this book is based on the dialogue between myself and Professor Allison over the years. I've learned the recent papers of Professor Allison, and I think it's necessary that we present the newest ideas and suggestions of Professor Allison to the world. So how do we move from being trapped to escaping the trap? If we have the risk of sliding into the trap, can we escape the Thucydides trap? Because this is a new era and we need new solutions.
So actually, in order to avoid falling into this trap, we have to understand the trap itself. So we have to avoid the misunderstanding and misjudgment of the current situation and also the trajectories of the issues related with these two countries. So first of all,
publish both the Chinese version and English version. 所说呢，这个是非常
which is very timely, just like being alluded to by Chairman Chen. This is the first launch in the world, and especially for Chinese version. And also we have the presence of Professor Allison here to witness and attend this launch. It is very meaningful. So I've been engaged with Professor Allison for many occasions, and as early as in 2019, March 2019, this is a CCG roundtable discussion between Harvard University and also CCG, and that is a really great beginning of the official engagement. And second time is such a very grand party. We have Professor Graham Allison, and also we have Dr. Fu Yin, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs. And so we were discussing whether or not we have a certain type of mode of discussion and a dialogue, or sort of informal format of discussion between all parties related with these two countries. And on that occasion, we actually had a very hot discussion on the point of cooperation between both sides. And also last year and this year, for 2 consecutive years, Professor Allison was invited as the keynote speaker, especially in the conference for safety in Munich. We were talking even further on more specific issues, for example, the climate issues related with China and US, and this year we're talking with these 3-party climate relations, which also include one more party, that is European countries. So 3 sides and 3 parties can play a lot in addressing the issues of climate change. So how to avoid this trap has a lot to do with many occasions. So we're very happy. Even during the COVID pandemic, we didn't stop communication with Professor Allison. For 2 times during COVID, we conducted that dialogue with Professor Allison for at least 2 hours for each one of the occasion, and we were discussing on the great powers relations and issues regarding these countries. And also last summer, we're very happy to be invited to Harvard University in the JFK School of Government, and we were having very happy dialogue with Professor Allison in person. So we agreed that China and the US need to cooperate, and both sides need to communicate to intensify the area of cooperation in the future, or the momentum of cooperation. And in this book, we touch upon a lot of issues and topics. For example, the relations between both sides and the China-U.S. geopolitical competition, the rise of China, the diplomatic policies from U.S. and the relations between U.S. and Russia, and also the global geopolitical issues and the nuclear weapons, the DPR case issues, COVID issues, and we're talking about a lot of areas like the economics and finance, as well as the CITIC and military and diplomatic solutions as to how to avoid the trap. So we're very frank and we're very conducive to the final solution. So how to avoid the Thucydides trap is very important. And I'd like to highlight that several chapters are very important. Very happy and also very grateful to Stranger Nature, and which is very influential press in the world. So since the publication of the first book, Destined for All, in 2017, and this year we have the second one. And going forward, actually, the changes of the power have changed during this period of time. So we need to have more topics to discuss. So looking forward into the future trend of the globalization. And yes, we are destined, China and US are destined to coexist. And this is the issue of the second chapter. And the third chapter is about the risks, the existence of risks of the war. But both sides have something to do to avoid the war. And the fourth chapter is about the avenues of escape, and some suggestions and some ideas and advices were raised from the history. So it means that we must summarize the experiences and lessons from the history, and also we have to actually escape or to cross over the trap. There are more details from the book to offer in each one of the chapters, especially, for example, the first chapter, the reason as to how the war happened, or what is the root causes of the Peloponnese War, as well as the significance that we can learn to avoid the trap, and also the eradication of the poverty from China, what lessons could be offered from this poverty alleviation from China, and what does it mean for the overall trend of the development in the world, and what can be done to avoid the Cold War or to mitigate the Cold War possibilities, and actually the rise of China affect US. And these are all described and explained in this chapter. As well, we can see the relative economic power have been changed between both countries. So in this book, we can see a lot of answers, and like the financial competitions between both sides, and the international reserve currency, which is dominated by US dollars. But right now, the RMB internationalization become trendy and is going to be promising in the future. What would be the implications from this trend? Like, for example, this is the competition in terms of the military forces and how to avoid the excessive competition in this regard. And also, what can we do within our range to avoid the excessive competition? And we can use the pathway of diplomatic resolutions. And previously, we have published Professor Joseph Nye's book regarding the soft power, also about the future of the international order, which is also very important content. So in the future, we're going to see the end of the unipolar world, and in the future, we're going to see the world with the diverse polars. And also, are we destined for all? And that is something we are always discussing about. If we are not careful, probably we will just accidentally fall into this trap of war. And Professor Allison had proposed very early that once we're in a war, the world will be collapsed and will be destroyed. And what are the similarities? What are the disagreements between China and US? And we see there are a lot of conflicts. So, for example, the Gaza bombardment and Ukraine war. So how to avoid the causes or the clues of the beginning of the war. And also there are some conflicting elements, for example, the Taiwan question, and how to escape the trap. As the fourth chapter, we must be reminded of certain possible triggers and also what values could be created and what kind of mentality should we need, and what kind of lessons could we learn from Dr. Kissinger's theory, and what is the image of the healthy relation between both sides, and what are the cases from history can we learn from. And also, there are any modes in the history of United States that we can join upon? Is there any area that we can cooperate while compete with each other? And there is some afterword beyond Thucydides trap. So beyond this current horizon of the history, what kind of story are we going to tell to the future generations? So competition and cooperation will be always coexisting with each other. And actually, Professor Allison always described there is two competitors which are rivals with each other. For example, Apple and Samsung, and they have competition, but at the same time they are cooperating with each other. And also, there are different actually pairs of competitors. They are competing with each other while servicing each other and complementary with each other. So.
Has coined very, very interesting.
Of course, in Chinese history, there are some stories to share, like 左传 and Jingchu rivalry. Jingchu in spring and autumn period of time in history, there is a rivals roaming around in that period of time, and a lot of things actually could be drawn upon. And Professor Allison, we must know him very well, very influential and very renowned professor, and also the founding father of JFK School of Government of Harvard University. I used to be working and studying in there. And Professor Allison is not only the director of the above center, but also the founding father of that center as well. So today I'm very happy Professor Allison being invited to be here in person, together with the officials and leaders from CITIC Press Group, together with the senior editor of the Springer Nature Group, Mr. Dre, all together here to together jointly how to escape the Thucydides trap and how to build a new model of major country relations or great powers relations. And we want to thank Professor Graham Allison and also the leadership from CITIC Press Group and also Press Group Macmillan. With that, I'd like to invite Dr. Maple Miao to moderate the next session, which is the speech that is going to be made by Professor and or me.
Graham, the Graham Allison is the founding dean of Harvard John F. Kennedy School of Government and author of Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides Trap, 2017. And also he wrote a book about Lee Kuan Yew, and also the Grand Master Insights on China, the United States and the World, 2013. 那么这本书也刚好中信出版社再版了，李光耀啊，论中国也是 Graham Allison 的这个他。
So this is the book edited by him.
Very fortunate to have Graham coming so long way. I mean, he just arrived last night. I know he has given talk this morning, and he will be here for a few days. But we are very pleased that he come to CCG. Of course, Graham is not only an academic, he was also served as Assistant Secretary of Defense and advised the Secretaries of Defense and every president from Reagan to Obama. So he's very knowledgeable. He has many students in the Department of Defense, Department of State Department, and I know that Harvard Kennedy School have trained so many talents worldwide. So it's really a great pleasure for CCG and all of us to welcome Graham to give the keynote. Welcome, Graham. 欢迎 Graham 教授。
So thank you very much. I think almost everything has been said. I'll try to be brief since I'll be interested in the questions and discussion. But let me say a special word of thanks to Henry and CCG and to CITIC for bringing out what I think is a quite remarkable volume. Henry sent me a copy last week in Boston, and I opened it up to look through it. I think I had never quite figured out how you were going to make this work, but I think you did, because by taking sharp questions and then weeding through whatever has been, since I've written, since Destined for War was published in 2017, and interviews and others, and getting short answers, pithy answers. I think you make a very lively read in just over 100 pages. So I'd say congratulations on the book, and for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at it, I suspect you'll find it interesting. That it's just, a question that you're interested in, and then in 2 pages or 1 page and a half, you get a short version of the answer. So what I thought I would do is introduce just a few ideas here. If we take the next slide here. Thucydides' trap, as Henry said, has the first actually international leader who picked up the idea and was very interested in it was Xi Jinping. And as early as actually slightly before the book was published, he had become interested in the topic because he and a number of his closest associates had really never paid much attention to Thucydides. And the idea that there was this famous Greek thinker who was roughly a contemporary of Confucius and who had some big ideas, including about patterns in history, he found fascinating. And as one of his closest associates, whom I got to know fairly well in the period after the publication of the book, said to me, he said, "Graham, why do you think President Xi Jinping keeps talking about the need for a new form of great power relations?" He said, because he's concluded that the old form of great power relations in the rivalries between rising powers and ruling powers have so often led to war. Well, that's actually Thucydides' big idea. So Thucydides, the founder and father of history, and someone for whom those of you in the analytic community, if he's not part of your mental library, shame on you. You should meet him, download his book. It's called The History of the Peloponnesian War. It's actually the first ever history book. It's chock full of interesting ideas. But one of his big ideas was about what happened that created the Peloponnesian War. And the idea, as he says, it was the rise of Athens, the very rapid rise of Athens, and the impact that had on Sparta, the ruling power at the time, that made the war almost inevitable. So Thucydides' trap, in a phrase, is the dangerous dynamic that occurs when a rapidly rising power seriously threatens to displace a major ruling power. So do it again. A rapidly rising power seriously threatens to displace a major ruling power. If we look at the world today, never before in history has a nation risen so fast, so far, on so many different dimensions as China. I mean, you see the miracle around you. You've lived the miracle. So a country that was poor, in which 90% of the people were trying to survive on less than $2 a day back in the 90s, has essentially eliminated abject poverty. And is, in terms of purchasing power parity, the best metric for measuring national economies, not only overtaken but surpassed the US to have the largest economy in the world. That's in like a single generation. Never again happened before in history. So a remarkable rise of a remarkable country and culture, the great rejuvenation of the great Chinese people, as Xi Jinping calls it, but the impact of that on a colossal ruling power, the US, that basically built the international order after World War II, a quite remarkable international order that has given us 78 years without a great power war. It's historically unprecedented. Is inevitably a Thucydidean rivalry. So that's the first big idea. Secondly, and I appreciate the comments by my American colleague from Springer, if there is a war between the US and China, of course it'll be a tragedy, it'll be a catastrophe, it'll be insane. Indeed, and if it was a full-scale war at the end of it, we won't have anything else to worry about. Because there won't be this building here. And we won't be here. And there won't be all the buildings at Harvard, and they won't be there. And our lives will be over, our societies will be over. So that's completely insane. Okay? But history is full of wars that made no sense. And that's why your Tolstoy quote is a good one. So the sense of tragedy, though, that the Greek dramatists, in which there was not just fate but an inevitable fate, is something that, interestingly, Thucydides disagreed with. So as he explains in his book, The History of the Peloponnesian War, the reason why I'm taking the trouble to write this book is because I hope we can learn the lessons from what happened here, the mistakes that were made, in order that future statesmen will be able to do better. Well, again, that's precisely my objective in the book, Destined for War. So I look in that book at the last 500 years. I put the current relationship between the US and China up on the tapestry of history. In the last 500 years, there were 16 great rivalries between a major rising power and a colossal ruling power. 12 of those ended in war, 4 of them in no war. So to suggest that war is inevitable would be fatalistic and defeatist. But to say that if all we do is business as usual, and all we can manage is diplomacy as usual, or statecraft as usual, then we should expect history as usual. And in this case, it could be a war between the US and China, not just a war, but a great war. Not just a great war, but a catastrophic war. So that's the big idea of Thucydides' trap. And what President Xi says, and I believe correctly, is that the notion that this is inevitable is wrong. Thucydides agrees with that, I agree with that. But that in order to avoid Thucydides' trap, it's going to be necessary to imagine some new form of great power relations. And when he initially floated this idea, when he was vice president back in 2014, he left it quite open, what's the content of this? Almost like it was a challenge for folks in the strategic community to work their way around this topic. And I think that remains the challenge that we need to deal with today. And again, I thank Henry and his colleagues at CCG for pushing this proposition forward in such an imaginative way. So here's my former professor, then my colleague and friend, and someone with whom I actually co-authored the last piece that he published before he died. So this was a foreign affairs piece published in October, and Henry left us at the ripe young age of 100 in December. He was received by Xi Jinping here in July. You may be familiar with that. And it was a very gratifying. Xi Jinping was so gracious and warm and friendly. And Henry actually felt like it was a kind of a fulfillment in his life in a significant way. And as Xi Jinping here says, the you can't think about U.S.-China relations without thinking about Henry. It was 50 years ago, 51 almost, that Henry came to begin the conversations with Zhou Enlai that basically changed the world. Established relations between two great states, relations that have been essential to what we've seen in the world since then, and with lots of interesting clues and lessons from them. So here's the piece that Henry and I published in October called AI and the Path to Arms Control, or the path to some constraints on the potentially most dangerous applications of AI. And I would say modestly, it's a pretty good piece. So it has lots of interesting ideas in it. It was part of actually an effort to encourage the meeting that occurred between Presidents Biden and Xi in San Francisco in November, and their conversation about how we can better create a foundation for cooperation between the US and China in the areas that matter most. But I think, as you can see from these two quotations, Henry alternated between pessimism and optimism. As he says, if you're looking at the recent events, it looks a lot like one of the cases in the Thucydides trap case file, the run-up to World War I, where neither side has much margin for error, and where disturbance could lead to catastrophic consequences. Both sides have convinced themselves that the other represents a strategic danger. We're on the path to a great power confrontation. So how did war occur between Germany and UK in 1914? An archduke from Austro-Hungary was visiting Serbia, and he was assassinated by a Black Hand terrorists who had some association with the Serbian government. That was a spark that produced a fire that was soon a conflagration that essentially burned down the whole of Europe. So how could such a little thing have such a huge consequence? The event was so insignificant that it didn't appear in the newspapers in New York. Probably not in China. I've not looked into that. But within 5 weeks, all of Europe was at war. So the idea that war makes no sense does not mean war cannot happen. The idea that parties who seriously don't want war could nonetheless find themselves in war is a fact from history. So all the more important, therefore, as Henry says, for the US and China to find a way to coexist without the threat of an all-out war. And as he said, he thinks that's still possible. So here's an assignment for you if you want to stretch your minds a little bit. Ask yourself, if we had a rational leader in Beijing and a rational leader in Washington, Corinne, which we actually do, and they're considering, given the conditions today, which should be more compelling, the incentives to compete with the other or the incentives to cooperate? So I gave you a little assignment sheet, since no Harvard presentation is complete without an assignment, I would suggest this afternoon when you go home, or this evening, take your sheet, and on the first page, incentives to compete. If you can't make 10 bullet points, you haven't thought hard enough about it. The US and China would be the fiercest rivals of all times, and they'll compete for all the reasons of history. And you should be able to work your lists here. But then turn the page over, exactly the other side. US versus China, incentives to cooperate. So again, we have rational leaders in both countries, and they're asking the question, well, what's the checklist of incentives to cooperate? That may be less obvious if you don't think about it, but I ask you to think about it. And let me give you a clue. If my survival requires me to find a level of cooperation with you, that's a pretty powerful incentive to cooperate. So if I face literally an existential threat, existential means threat to my existence as a country, that I cannot cope with myself alone without cooperation with you, I'd say that sounds like a pretty sturdy, serious incentive to cooperate. And if you work your way down that list, it shouldn't take you very long to think about, well, how about a nuclear war? At the end of a nuclear war, everyone's dead. As Ronald Reagan taught us, a nuclear war cannot be won, because if at the end of it your society is destroyed, must therefore never be fought. In the climate arena, we now know that we live on a small planet in an enclosed biosphere. Either nation's greenhouse gases go into the same biosphere. So either by itself could, on the previous trajectory, make a biosphere nobody can live in. Well, that's called survival. Well, that's a pretty powerful incentive. There's 2 clues. You should be able to do 10. So which side? The incentives to compete, incentives to cooperate. And my belief is that the answer is both. They're absolutely compelling to compete. It's absolutely compelling to cooperate. And therefore, the challenge is to somehow keep these two seem partially contradictory ideas in our head at the same time and still function. Now, in order to try to think about that, I, as Henry suggested, and the book has not only these, but thanks to Henry and the CCG team, you pushed even further. But here are several examples from Chinese history and wisdom. As we're trying to think about how to escape Thucydides' trap. The first one that I like very much is the idea of rivalry partners, which is the way that the relationship between the Sung and the Liao is often characterized as they were fierce rivals, but unable to come to either to defeat the other. In the Chanyan Treaty, about 1,000 years ago, they agreed to be rivalry partners. In some arenas, they would be fierce rivals. In other arenas, they would be thick partners. And that treaty provided peace for only 120 years. So I would say in history, that's a pretty good record. The second idea, which you all are familiar with much more than I am, most of you, is the Sun Tzu's story about Wu and Yue. So here are 2 deadly adversaries. They're on a ship. Ship sinks. They're prisoners, and they're going to be taken to a prison. Ship sinks, and the 2 of them escape, and they get into a small rowboat, just the 2 of them. But the rowboat is too wide for either of them to hold both oars. So if only one can row, the little rowboat goes around. So in order to get to the shore to survive, they have to cooperate. That's a pretty compelling reason to cooperate. Xi Jinping added a whole new idea to this at the meeting that Henry already referred to with the senators, Chuck Schumer and others, and surprised them. And actually, this is a phrase I had never seen or heard before. He said to them, I am in you, and you are in me. Excuse me, what does that mean? Okay, Chinese will understand it better than an American, and the senators hardly knew how to interpret this. But the idea that I am in you and you are in me, well, that's a level of complexity and subtlety that escapes most Americans, who are more simplistic. So we like more things black and white or either or, but I think correctly, life is more complicated. So I think it's a very interesting idea there. And then finally, you're familiar with yin yang and the ideas in, again, Chinese civilization of having contradictions between a thesis and antithesis that gets resolved in the synthesis, which then leads to the next round. But again, levels of subtlety and complexity. So just to conclude, so what the book does is begin struggling with the notion how to escape Thucydides' trap. Does not have a fixed solution. Indeed, I think what's happening currently, as you can see both in the American government and in the Chinese government, is people are stretching for what Kissinger called a strategic concept. Some concept that'll help us understand how you can both be competing and cooperating at the same time. That was something that Kissinger and Xi Jinping talked about in their meeting in August. It's one that Henry kept stretching for. I think nobody yet has got a picture that works, but I think this is a way of stimulating imagination. And I think the challenge over the next period will be for leaders in both countries to find ways of both conceptualizing this and then operationalizing it in their policies. So to end on an up note, I would say the good news for me about what's happened in U.S.-Chinese relations recently, which was already referred to, was what was achieved by Presidents Xi and Biden in San Francisco, in which they demonstrated that two rational leaders can sit down and talk at great length, privately, candidly, without this becoming public, about the things that matter to them most, including that war between the two countries would be catastrophic and each of them understand it, about ways in which that might happen, for example, over Taiwan, and about what actions they would take to ensure that doesn't happen. So what was done there, I think, not just put a floor under what was previously a spiraling, deteriorating relationship, it actually produced a foundation, a pretty stable foundation on which we can now, I think, build something sustainable. But again, in doing that, we're going to have to conceptualize this set of seeming contradictions. So again, to conclude, I would just say, Henry, thanks to you and CITIC and the team for an impressive product, and I look forward to the continuing discussion.
Thank you very much from the wonderful remark from Professor Allison. Your views and reflection are really inspiring and stimulating, always. And now let's take a group photo together. It's a very, very great opportunity for many people, I think, today. So let's have a group photo here. Please. 我们现在一起有一个合影，请。
Yes, we can have a group photo here. And also we have the leader from CITIC Press Group, and we have the senior editor from Springer Nature Group. So please come to the stage for the group photo.
Okay, good afternoon and also good day. And so we're going to start our CCG Global Dialogue. And since 2021, we actually made almost 100 dialogues with different global opinion leaders and great global thinkers. And Graham Allison has been twice on our global CCG Global Dialogue. So we are very pleased again today we come to CCG and have another occasion to have a global dialogue with Professor Graham Allison on the occasion of this new book, Escaping Thucydides' Trap, my dialogue with Graham Allison. So it's really fascinating. And also, of course, I mean, Graham, we probably need another more introduction for our present audience, but I think for the online audience, I just want to introduce him again. And Professor Graham Allison is the Douglas Dillon Professor of the Government at Harvard Kennedy School, and he's the founding dean of Harvard Kennedy School, which is a visionary for doing that, and he's former director of Belf Center for Science and International Affairs. And also, Professor Graham Allison has served as a key position in the government of the U.S., including the Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration, and also Special Advisor of Defense, of Secretary of Defense under the President Reagan. So he has also continuously advised in the government. And of course, Graham Allison is a great friend of China, and he has been traveled many times to China, has actually been to CCG, and I recently been able to, work and talk with Professor Graham Allison for the last decade and more. And just recently, we met almost every month. We met in Davos in the Munich Security Conference, March at CCG. So today we're going to talk about this book. Professor Allison's famous work, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? That book was published in 2017. And so his view has generated enormous global attention and global debate, but also a global awareness of how dangerous could be if we did not follow the right path of avoiding this conflict. So we have published this book, largely based on our dialogues, but also many thought that Graham has published recently, and the interviews and articles that he has. So the book is actually to introduce, how we can find ways to escape the trap, and also we published that in both Chinese and English. And today is the occasion that we had published for the both editions, which is great. We thank Macmillan, Palgrave, and also CITIC Press for collaborating on this great book. So Graham, now we probably will come to you, and in your presentation just now, in your presentation on the slides, you talk about competition, cooperation, and also you give the assignment for all of us to do. I mean, we hope we will do that. So we are now living in a very different world now, and of course we are living in a nuclear age. And I remember last time when we talked with each other, you mentioned that this is very dangerous if we are not careful. If we have getting into the hot war, Boston would be gone, Beijing would be gone, and Washington would be gone. That's you are famous for your thesis on the Cuba crisis, also nuclear crisis at that time. But we are probably in that kind of we're still in a nuclear age, and we're currently have two war. So this it's more significant now to escape the Thucydides trap. So given the contemporary conditions, and of course a lot of people also said that maybe we talk about the Thucydides trap, are we going to talk us into the self-fulfilling prophecy on that? But seriously, how can we make people more aware of this, and maybe what are the really the risks that are facing us. I mean, we are particularly on this Ukraine, war, and also, Gaza war going on. And so how do you see the world today? And are we at the brink of a third world war now? So, I mean, Thucydides trap is really getting close now. So how can we assess the global situation and, avoid the Thucydides trap? So, Graham, please.
Oh, thank you. Is this on? Good. So, again, thank you, Henry and CCG, for such a good job in producing the book. And I thank you. I was surprised when reading through it how coherent you had made the answers to the questions. So I appreciate that. Chinese, I don't know enough about the current. I know many Chinese very well, but I don't know in the broad sweep how many Chinese have much appreciation of history. In the U.S., it's often said we live in the United States of amnesia. So people think if something didn't happen in my lifetime, it couldn't happen. So if you say, well, there could be a war, no, war is obsolete. How about a real war in Europe? Most Europeans couldn't believe it until all of a sudden they find Putin invading Ukraine. And now, as you saw at Munich, there's this kind of wake-up going on across Europe as people think, oh my God, there really are tanks and planes and missiles that they're exploding and killing people and destroying. So again, the idea of a great power war seems the most, when I talk to students at Harvard, oh, that couldn't happen. Hasn't happened in my lifetime, as if that was dispositive, or hasn't happened even in my parents' lifetime. Well, that means it couldn't happen? No, absolutely not. Well, how about nuclear weapons and the use of nuclear weapons? That must be obsolete, or that's forbidden. It was taboo. Taboos are never broken. Well, I would say it's very hard to get people to think seriously about what are clearly real, undeniable risks in the international security environment. So was it a real serious threat when Putin began talking about conducting tactical nuclear weapon strikes on Ukraine back in October, November 2022, after the invasion, but then once it stalled? The American intelligence community concluded the chance was about 50-50. So do it again. It's about a 50% chance that Putin would have conducted nuclear strikes. The Chinese intelligence community, I don't know what they concluded, but in any case, as they thought about this, in a collaborative action between both the U.S. and China, Xi Jinping then issued a public warning saying, we oppose any threat or use of nuclear weapons. And before he made such a public statement, this was when Chancellor Schultz was here in November of 22, he obviously called Putin, with whom he has a very close relationship, and said, I've thought about this. I think this is not a good idea. Not a good idea for China. And my wish list, working with the U.S. government on the side, the thing I wished for most was that China would suggest to Putin why this was a bad idea. So that's another interesting example of how certainly thoughtful, serious leaders are taking seriously the possibility that one thing could lead to the other, that would lead to a war, even a great power war. Second example, just to So the fact that Biden and Xi met in San Francisco took out in the midst of a campaign in which there's obviously no political advantage to being friendly to China. Indeed, there's every political advantage for who can bash China more dramatically. That Biden took out a long day to spend with Xi Jinping in which they would talk privately about what they really thought mattered. And that included war, Taiwan, AI, climate, the overall relationship. We don't know even all the topics. We certainly don't know what they said to each other. Again, I regard that as great. If you're going to have serious relations between countries, you have to have private, candid, secure conversations between them, starting with the leaders. But if I now watch and see what happened since that meeting, you can infer a little bit about the conversation. So we've been through a very rocky period over Taiwan with the elections and the election of a new president who has many inclinations towards trying to declare a more independent Taiwan. But if I watch the behavior of both the Chinese government and the American government, it's been very restrained, almost as if it had been choreographed a little bit. Well, I usually try to read the tea leaves and see what's to interpret. I interpret from that, again, that we had two leaders, thought seriously about the problem, worked their way through it. So I would say I worry a lot about the ways in which misunderstandings, misperceptions, miscalculations, and some third party's provocation could end up dragging people to a place they don't want to go. And that's why, again, I think it's been so important that the Biden-Xi conversations have continued. And then what's followed from that was similar conversations among trusted agents on both sides, including now these working groups. So I'm feeling somewhat more optimistic about the situation currently. Sorry, that's a long answer.
No, that's
it's a
great.
Complicated question.
You have a very good vision and also answer to the current crisis we're facing, but also how important China-U.S. Top leaders talk to each other, and of course, getting on the same wavelength in terms of how to cooperate. One thing I'd like to follow a bit further. You actually mentioned in that list that you ask everybody to think about. I think it's a great list, incentive to cooperate. I think that, for example, we are living in really in the intertwined world, as President Xi said, you are in us, we are in you, I mean, we cannot separate. So I'm thinking now is that the current global order, current situation is that there's no more common objective or common interest to bind all the parties to talk to each other. And you remember we had the Munich Security Conference for 3 times in a row, which you participated. We talk about climate change. So the climate change is probably threat number 1 facing mankind. And then we have a pandemic we just finished. We haven't cooperated, and that has a big casualties for all of us. And of course, we are having the digital world now. We are having AI. We're having all those things. So do you think how can we get better cooperation? Maybe should we have a new international mechanism, a multilateral system? Or maybe now we're talking about multipolar world, but yet there's no multipolar system to support that. So in order to create a more incentive to cooperate, what we should do more, or what we can work on those things, and particularly US and China as 2, and plus EU as the 3 largest economy in the world, like we were just said in Munich last month, 3 largest economy, 3 largest political influence. They should take some examples to work together so that we don't talk about the differences. Let's talk about similarities and the common challenges. What do you think?
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I'd say that I think the reason for working through this exercise of both what are the reasons why I'm going to be a fierce competitor, but then also the same list or the list on the backside, what are the reasons why I'm going to be a serious cooperator or serious partner, is to start with our interests. Because I think, and when I start down my hierarchy of interests, the core interest of each state or the leader of each state is to ensure the survival of his state. So if my survival depends on your survival, I mean, if really I am in you and you are in me, I've used the analogy in America, there's a, we call it inseparable conjoined Siamese twins. So imagine two human beings, which this happens in nature from time to time, are born, and Henry and I have the same GI system. 2 heads, two hands, 2 brains, but literally joined and inseparably. So if that's true, however frustrating my behavior is, however dangerous I'm behaving, however deserving I am to be strangled, when you think about it, you think, if I strangle them, I might have a moment of satisfaction, but then I will have committed suicide. Well, that's a pretty powerful reason not to do that, to find some way to cooperate. So I would say I work down the interests. First, no great war, especially no nuclear war, because at the end of that, everything's destroyed. And climate, just what you said. So if either of us can make the climate uninhabitable for both of us, you and I have to find some way to cooperate in constraining them. And it's not only the two, we just happen to be the 2 most important economies and 2 most important societies. Obviously, we have to take some account of the other. I go down the list. How about the financial system? The financial system today is so entangled that in 2008, when Wall Street created a financial crisis that produced the Great Recession in the US, the world was teetering on the edge of a Great Depression. And why was that avoided? Because cooperation between US and China had a joint stimulus, each a huge stimulus, and Hank Paulson, who was the Secretary of Treasury at the time, and who was the principal actor on the American side, has said frequently that he thought the Chinese action was at least as important as the American stimulus. So again, a Great Depression would not be the end of the world. It was not as bad as a nuclear war. But the Great Depression is pretty terrible. And if you remember the Great Depression of the 1930s, that provided the environment in which emerged Nazism and fascism and the forces that ended up leading to World War II. So again, there's one. Now, pandemics, you said. Excuse me, if a virus like COVID emerges somewhere, and it will again, for sure, the impact on all the societies is real. The interest, therefore, in having early identification in the COVID story, the Chinese scientists published a genome, a sequence, with, I think, in 6 days or something. That was necessary for the story of the creation of the vaccines. Again, there was not sufficient cooperation in my view, but I think if we work down that list, we have a lot of reasons for thinking that the countries can cooperate. But I think that in the world in which things are either or black and white, that doesn't quite work, which is why I think it's so important that we realize the complexity of the situation and find our ways to some conceptualization that doesn't deny that it's going to be fiercely rivalrous on one hand and deeply cooperative on the other.
Thank you, Graham. Excellent. You have these vivid examples. Particularly, you mentioned Hank Paulson that when he was a Treasury, financial secretary, and then when we have this 2008 financial crisis, we actually worked together. I mean, that's how the G20 got established.
Absolutely.
And China has 4 trillion stimulus packages, which is even China has a big problem. China continued even also during the early Asian financial crisis. China didn't devalue RMB. So absolutely, we are in the same boat. 190 countries, like President Xi said, we are in the same boat. We sink and float together. So we have to work with each other. Now, given the time, I have a last question before we open to our journalist friends. I received your article when you sent it to me, published on the Foreign Affairs with Henry Kissinger. His last piece of great article, co-author with you, and actually that was also published before the San Francisco President Xi and President Biden summit. So you and Kissinger are very visionary to propose this AI cooperation. It can be double-edged sword, this AI. So of course, I mean, what's your advice now for the future? I mean, that has been already brought into the attention of both governments to talk about. But maybe the world should pay more attention. Also, I really appreciate you mentioned about Kissinger also during your presentation. Now, Dr. Henry Kissinger has passed away. Where's the new Kissinger? We look at you and others, Hank Paulson, maybe others, to really steer through the Sino-U.S. relation, more constructive national voices. So we are really appreciative that you and Kissinger made this AI aware of the governments between China and U.S. particularly. And I hope that we can continue to identify the risk and propose all those constructive proposals in the future. So maybe your last answer for the discussion.
Well, thank you. I as I mentioned, I first became a student of Henry Kissinger's way before most of the people here were born. I enrolled in his class when I was a graduate student at Harvard in 1965. And the joke was, but for Henry's birthday, his 100th birthday, there were several parties, and people would occasionally, then people give toasts and so forth. And I was often introduced he was introduced as the longest suffering continuing education professor at Harvard with the slowest learner in continuing education. And I said that I was proud of that I continued learning from him all those years. And I never had any encounter with him that I didn't learn a lot. And then we became colleagues and friends and even co-authors, as you said. So he had become obsessed by AI as a new phenomenon that he thought would be as challenging for society as nuclear weapons had been when he was a young person working on these topics. And he knew that they were very different. He also knew that when he became interested in this, he was about 95 years old. When he told me he was going to do this, I said to him, Henry, don't think about this. You have enough things to think about. Enough things. This is a whole new arena. He said, no, I'm thinking about it. Fortunately, Eric Schmidt, the guy who had been the chief executive of Google and who had been interested in AI, agreed to become like a tutor for both Henry and me. And so we learned a lot, but still about a millimeter deep, not very deep. But nonetheless, I think he rightly identified the possibilities of applications of AI that could have seriously catastrophic consequences for not only each society, but for mankind. And so how to put your head around that? The article struggles with that. And it suggests that, on the one hand, it's attempting to say, this is impossible. I mean, never is a technology advanced at such a rate as AI is currently advancing. I had lunch today with one of the AI leaders here in China, and trying to understand how he sees what's happening. But certainly, if you look in the American story, companies are doing everything they can to jump ahead of the other one. This is different from nuclear, but nonetheless, if you go back 80 years, when nuclear weapons were first introduced, the question of what was going to happen and how and whether they could be controlled and whether there was going to be nuclear Armageddon and whether that could, all those were the similar questions. And lo and behold, as a result of strategic imagination, statecraft, stick-to-itiveness, over the last 78 years, we've not seen a single nuclear weapon used in war. It's an amazing accomplishment. Not a fixed job, not fixed, it's not completed, but an amazing work in progress. And there's not been a great power war. Again, historically unprecedented. So I think trying to reflect on lessons learned in that story, both for inspiration and for insights, is what the article challenges us to do. Now, fortunately, Xi Jinping had been interested in AI already for a long time. And so he and Henry had talked about this a couple of times earlier. And so they had a very serious conversation about it in the visit in August. And then that informed this piece that we wrote and helped nudge the meeting that occurred. And it seems to me that in that meeting and the conversations, they were clearly two serious leaders who take the challenge seriously. They agreed then to encourage early conversations both between some of their trusted agents, because obviously in China, the Chinese government is trying to make sure that in the development of AI, there are no rogue actors applying this in a way that could have catastrophic consequences for China. And in the U.S., the U.S. government is trying to do the same thing. So obviously we have some interest in talking about what are you doing and what am I doing and what works and what doesn't work. In the nuclear arena, even though the U.S. and the Soviet Union at the time were the superpowers, and they were deadly adversaries, they could agree that it would be better that there were not more nuclear weapon states. So basically, the non-proliferation regime limited the number of new nuclear weapon states to prevent a world nuclear anarchy. Well, today, there are two AI superpowers. Could they slow the development of AI or the proliferation of AI, especially large language models that could have the most dangerous application? Maybe. That would be difficult, but not impossible. So it seems to me that this is a topic that needs to be pushed ahead in the conversations, and there will be, as there already are, some track 2 conversations. There'll be academics working on it in both China, and I was at Tsinghua this morning, and Sui Lan, who's there, has been part of these conversations. So I would suspect that's the path ahead, and if the nuclear analogy is helpful, in the early conversations between the parties, they were very exploratory. They didn't lead to any particular conclusions. They helped each other see how each was seeing it, to understand the vocabulary, to see what ideas they had. So I would say that's, at least I would hope to, what I would see going forward.
Okay, great. I think this is really visionary. I think that you and Henry Kissinger proposed this AI concept, and also I'm glad that President Xi, President Biden talked about that, and President Xi also talked to Henry Kissinger, as you mentioned. So this is really getting the attention of the world, and if U.S. and China can collaborate on that to prevent the damage side, the side effect of AI, we will probably in a better and safe world. So thank you. We hope that you will carry on this Kissinger spirit and be a great supporter and promoter, and of course a great contributor to the American-China relations. So I think we probably conclude the dialogue part, which is a dialogue about our new book, how to escape this trap, that Professor Graham Allison joined this CCG book launching event. I'm Henry Wang. I'm the founder and president of Center for China Globalization, and thank all of you for coming. And before I leave, I would like to, I know you probably talk about Henry Kissinger's birthday. You have a birthday tomorrow. As I hope we have a panda gift for you. And so we just give it to show our appreciation for coming to CCG. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Looking forward to the pandas returning.
That's right.
to the
Yeah.
US.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So, continue. You have some Q&A from some.
And thank you so much. The very fantastic dialogue between Professor Allison and Dr. Wang. And right now, the floor is open to the questions. We would like to take questions from our media. Today, there are so many international media and domestic media who would like to ask questions. So maybe I know the question from 央视玉渊谈天.
Yuan Tantian from CNG, from CCTV.
Hello, Dr. Graham. I'm the reporter from China Media Group. I noticed that recently the U.S. House of Representatives passed the TikTok Desertive Bill, and the U.S. government also continued to restrict the Chinese technology industry, which also influenced the new energy vehicles. So how do you think of the competition between the Chinese and the U.S. government? And the next question is, what do you think of what can be done to avoid this kind of the Thucydides trap? So thank you.
Maybe it's first.
Sorry. In the technology arena, we should expect the rivalry to become more intense. And one sees that in part in the attempt by the U.S. to constrain the exports of the most advanced semiconductors, which is already having some impact on the development of AI here in China. And that's because in many arenas, the U.S. and China will be fierce rivals, each attempting to be ahead of the other as far as it can be. So I would say that's part of the rivalry part that's inevitable almost. In the EV space, or in the green technologies, it's even going to be more interesting because basically thanks to its own industrial policy and the innovation and operations of its own companies, China now essentially owns everything green and clean. So I wrote a piece, actually, I don't think it's in this book, but it was after, called America's Green Future Will Be Red. If you look at every green technology, China produces 70% of it, 80% of it. If you look at the inputs to it, China produces 70% of it or 80% of it. So take, for example, solar panels. Last year, China installed more solar panels in China than the U.S. has installed in the U.S. in the whole 25 years in which the U.S. has been installing solar panels. Absolutely amazing. And actually, what China did last year in renewable technologies was such a great leap forward that it's quite likely that, as opposed to the target, which had been peak greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, that goal may be met by 2025, maybe even sooner, maybe even this year, conceivably. So that capability is great for the world. I mean, basically, Chinese solar panels are 70% cheaper than anybody else's. And therefore, the more they're used globally, the more this will produce energy without greenhouse gases, the better that is for the biosphere. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, if you're a company, let's take, for example, in the US, an auto company, or in Germany, an auto company, and BYD wants to sell its EVs in the US or Europe, well, excuse me, I mean, you can buy a BYD entry-level car, I think it's Seagull, for less than $10,000 here in China. And what's the cheapest EV in the US? It costs about $27,000, $28,000. So China, when it mass produces or scale produces manufactured product, has an ecosystem that's basically dominant. But the impact of that on other nations' economies and companies and unions will lead to a lot of pushback. So I would say that's another arena where there's these balance and trade-offs. So I'm looking for or expecting a future in which there'll be very fierce competition and constraints and debates and discussion. We'll probably even, in the same way that there's a good book that was published this year called Chip Wars, there'll be another book called EV Wars or Green Wars or Tech Wars, or where there'll be competition and rivalry, and that'll have to be balanced. I mean, you would like to say, well, let's just get over it. We're not going to get over it. It's going to be a struggle. But you need to be balanced by the recognition that at the same time we're rivals, we're also interdependent partners. So I would say that's my bet about the likely future.
Okay, thank you. Maybe another question from Phoenix TV.
Thank you, Professor Allison. My name is Emily from Phoenix TV. We noticed the U.S. Ambassador Nicholas Burns has recently described the relationship between China and the U.S. as a battle of ideas. But we also know the U.S. scholar Mearsheimer has long warned these kind of ideological claims is a great illusion of the U.S. So I'm just wondering, what do you think? What eventually are the two countries competing about? And also, second question is, what do you think is going to happen if former President Donald Trump takes office again? Thank you.
Another easy question, yes. So two very different questions. So the battle of ideas or the ideological conflict or the systems conflict is complicated and easily gets too frequently oversimplified. President Biden describes it as a battle between democracy and autocracy. Again, I don't think that quite captures the, it's a simplification. But I think there is ultimately a battle of ideas about how to organize and govern a society. So Xi Jinping believes that that governing a complex society like China requires a party-led, I would put it in my terms, autocracy or more authoritative system in which the party, as basically the leadership vanguard, plays a critical role in leading the society in order to create sufficient order in order to have a successful society. And that story is playing out. And if you look at the story of China's spectacular growth over the past generation or two, it's been pretty impressive. Nobody can deny. The American story is a different story. So whereas Chinese put order, or at least the Xi Jinping leadership, and Chinese tradition puts order as kind of the central political idea, American society has been built on a different idea that puts liberty, individual liberty, as the central idea. And the American Declaration of Independence declares universally that, quote, all human beings are created with endowed rights by their creator to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that means everybody, Hong Kongese, Taiwanese, Chinese, Indians, Africans, everybody. And that means that, and Americans have been historically pretty persistent in trying to promote those ideas, even though they have been struggling to realize them at home. So that's been a struggle within the society. So I think that in fact there are competing ideas there. My resolution or my suggestion about that is that as long as the US and China compete peacefully in a world in which they're coexisting, each to show which model can better govern their society and better produce what people want, that seems to me to be a reasonable issue. And whether, given the complexities of the 21st century, and the absolute overload of information and misinformation with social technologies and all the various media, whether a society like the US can actually remain unified or ends up becoming so sharply divided, or can function successfully as opposed to being dysfunctional, which our government has certainly been recently. Or, on the other hand, whether the Chinese system falls victim to the traditional weaknesses and failures of an autocracy because it becomes more insecure, becomes more controlling, it becomes more cautious, and therefore more limiting of the imagination and innovation that comes from a more open and freer society. We'll see. So my suggestion about this has always been we should let the experiment play out. In 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, it may turn out that everybody agrees to be governed, it needs to be more like this. And it may be that 50 years from now, or 20, everybody agrees it needs to be more like that. So I'm sorry, that's not a very concise answer, but that's my, on Trump, another big wild card. So for most of you, you probably are having trouble believing that Donald Trump would be the nominee for the Republican Party for election in 2024. Certainly most Americans have been very slow to wake up to the fact. Henry and I mentioned, or Henry mentioned that we were all at Davos, both Davos and Munich. And the elephant in the room was this idea that, wait a minute, is Trump real? Could this be happening? Is this America? What the hell is going on? Okay, was basically the question over and over. And I would say, yes, it's real. Trump will be the Republican nominee. If the election were held today, it's essentially a toss-up. He's actually slightly ahead in most of the swing states. So if he should return to office, then I think this will be a very different relationship. And I think we saw the first installment of that in his first term. But in the first term, you had a president who hadn't really figured out how government worked, and had in the government many people who came from, who were traditional American foreign policy types, like, say, Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, whom Trump found frustrated him because he would want something to happen, but since Trump hadn't figured out how to cause it to happen, the system resisted him. I think this time he would be likely to have lieutenants that would be more loyal and would be able to do more of the things that he intended to do. And so I would say, again, if Thucydides were watching, he would say that, stay tuned, yes.
Any other questions from media? Yes, please. You can introduce which media you're from.
Thank you, Professor Allison. I'm from the Beijing News. I have a question also about the U.S. elections. So what's your anticipation for the relations between China and the United States in the year of 2024, as we all know that the relations tend to be much more fragile in the election year than other normal years. And you just share your view on what would happen if former President Donald Trump was re-elected. So what would happen if President Biden was re-elected? Would there be some more positive policies toward China since he's already had 4 years in office? Thank you.
Very good questions, thank you. So that gives me actually an opportunity to say something that I wanted to say. So let me be precise here. Though I've said to several people already, I want to apologize as an American for what you're likely to see in the year ahead. The U.S. has entered what Americans call our silly season, in which case the hyperbole that's so common in political discourse already becomes so extreme that the connection between what comes out of politicians' mouths and reality is almost disconnected. And unfortunately, that's true for both candidates or both campaigns. In the case of this 2024 campaign, one thing almost everybody can agree on is bashing China. So you're going to hear lots of terrible, nasty things said about China by the two candidates and by candidates for the Senate and by candidates for Congress. So you can hardly get in trouble in the U.S. for saying something nasty about China. The people seem to compete to see who can be tougher on China than the other guy. And what I say to Chinese colleagues in the government and outside, especially for people in the press, you have to remember Americans are strange, and American campaigns are unusual. So Americans are people that engage in American football games in which two people who know each other well on opposite teams play for 60 minutes trying to crush the other person violently. And then at the end of the game, put their arms around each other and go have a beer. So when I have some Chinese students at Harvard, they said, this is crazy. You can't have one hand slapping someone and the other hand hugging them. And I said, normal people maybe don't do that, but Americans do. Okay? So it's a pretty strange behavior. So here's the one consolation in that picture. Remember, however nasty anything is that's said by either candidate, Trump or Biden, each will say even nastier things about their American opponent. Now, I'm not trying to excuse this or justify it, but when you hear someone say something about Xi Jinping or China that you think, wait a minute, this is just over the top, watch and see what they say about their American opponent. It'll be even more extreme. Again, I'm not trying to justify, or I'm just trying to explain so we understand the context. And I'm sorry, I missed your second. If Biden, yes. So let me go back to the point I made earlier. I think in the San Francisco meeting and in the what the Chinese government calls the spirit of San Francisco that's followed, you get a pretty good picture of Biden and what he believes about the relationship between the U.S. and China. So he did not like the fact that the relationship was spiraling downwards. He began a mid-course correction after halfway through his term that began at Bali, where he and Xi had, again, a very good conversation. This is back in the fall of 2022. There was then the balloon incident that blew things off course for a bit, but which then was recovered in first the meetings between Jake Sullivan and Wang Yi, and then by Biden and Xi at San Francisco. So I believe their serious private candid conversation was about building not a floor, as I said, but a foundation for a stable, sustainable relationship going forward that'll have a big chunk of competition and rivalry, but a big chunk of cooperation and partnership. And I think they're each both struggling, and their governments are struggling to find ways to articulate that, which is another reason why, as Henry and I were talking earlier, I think this is an opportunity for people in the analytic community, both in China and in the US, to try to help appreciate that the reality does really require that both of these things are going to be happening at the same time. It's going to be very uncomfortable, it's going to be messy, but it's still, Wu and Yue got to the shore, okay? If you're in me and I'm in you, I don't want to commit suicide, you don't want to commit suicide, so we're probably going to find a way to coexist.
Okay, I believe there are a lot of questions will be raised, but time is limited. Let me take the last question, please, from media. Yeah. Maybe, yes, please. Yes, sir. Introduce yourself firstly.
Professor, and I'm Henry from Phoenix New Media and colleague of Emily. So I also go to Munich Security Conference this year, and I'm very interested in Professor's climate might, mutual assured destruction. I think it's a good concept, and it's it's popular maybe in part of elites, in the policymakers, but maybe I think the populists will, especially the climate skeptics like Donald Trump, they would not buy it. So how to turn a wonderful concept into actions? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think first it'll help to have both in the analytic community and in the press discussion of what means climate mad. Most people don't quite get it. I think now, today, most people agree climate is a serious threat. Most people agree we need to take major actions to deal with greenhouse gas emissions. But most people still haven't quite got to the point that John Kennedy got to after the Cuban Missile Crisis, to say, wait a minute, we live on a very small planet. Here's this little teeny planet, and it's in an enclosed biosphere. And it's just a physical fact. And my greenhouse gas emissions and yours go into the same biosphere. Doesn't really make much difference which one of us emitted the greenhouse gases. The impact is the same on both of us. And either of us could, on the previous trajectory, make the whole thing uninhabitable for both of us. So that would be crazy. So that's pretty powerful motivation. And I think actually the governments recognizing that motivation, and China dramatically, have now taken seriously advancing the technologies that will allow human beings to meet their energy demands, which they're going to meet one way or the other, by renewable alternatives that don't have such climate consequences. So I think this is an area in which it's not, I mean, I think there's general public recognition, but where one could make more intelligible what the potential risks are and why, as I say frequently, China made a great leap forward for mankind in advancing green technologies at prices that could be affordable globally, that'll allow people to meet energy demands without or with fewer greenhouse gas emissions. And I would say the same thing in the US. So from the US side, Biden certainly gets the idea, and a substantial part of what his Inflation Reduction Act is about is setting very ambitious targets for greenhouse gas emissions, and then trying to develop the technologies or try to deploy the technologies that'll make this possible. So that's the good news side of it. But as we go back to the earlier question, the bad news side is that each will care about whether China makes the technology advances or the US does. Well, if it's made and both of us can use it, that's great. So I always say to people, suppose a vaccine or a medicine was invented in China that would help my wife who had a disease, recover. Would I care? I would give thanks for whoever did it. So those are advances for mankind, but at the same time they have distributional consequences about which we will end up struggling. I think, again, it's a great example where if my survival requires, well, that's pretty compelling. And that should constrain unreasonable competitive instincts. But I think the balance will be the challenge for leadership. And I think in Biden and Xi Jinping, we have leaders that understand that.
Okay, Thank you very much, Professor Allison. I think it's a fantastic and wonderful and provoking occasion from your ideas and this new book. And everyone with the sheet, just Graham gave us the U.S.-China incentives to cooperate. I feel all of those, yes. Yeah, a lot of answers. I think we need a longer list for that cooperation, shorter list for competition. So thank you all. As the time is limited, we have to end this conversation. But all the media people, if you are interested in having further communication, I think we can leave for a while. After maybe in half hour, we have another occasion to continue our interview. Thank you all of you, and thank you audience. We know there's hundreds, thousands of the audience online for today's live stream. It's a wonderful event, I think, today, and a very important occasion, I think, for the remarkable history for the future. It's a future-driven event, I think. Thank you, your great opinion, Professor. Thank you, all the participants. Thank you, Dr. Wang, and the CCG team, and our partner from the presses, and from Springer Nature and the CITIC Press. Thank you all.